So we're already inserting and reading from a local database, and we have also learned a little bit about data binding, which is going to help us create the list that we are going to be using to display what we are reading from the database. This list is going to be defined in the history page.saml, just in the same class where we are reading from the database. Eventually, what we read from the database is going to be displayed into the interface. And that is what we're going to learn how to do in this lecture. But first, of course, we have to define the list inside of SAML to be able to later populate it with the elements that we have recovered from the table. So the first thing that I'm going to do is get rid of the definition of the content inside of the content page, because we don't really need that anymore. What we need inside is a list view. The list view is a type of element that will allow us to define a list of elements inside of the interface. So this list view is going to be defined with an opening tag and a closing tag like this, so we can later add some more definitions inside of it. But the very first thing that we want to set is the name for the list view, because we are going to want to access this list view from the historypage.saml.cs file. This is simply going to be called post list view, because it's a list view that is going to be displaying post objects. And now that we have access to it, we have to take the first step that we mentioned that was necessary to apply data binding, and that is to establish the data context, or the source. In this case, we're going to set the source directly from the C# file, and we're going to be doing it right after getting it. In this case, it is the posts list, the one that is going to be the source for the data binding. This is going to be the data context. And what we can do is go to posts list view and set the item source to be this list of posts. Having the item source, we now have the source for the elements that this list is going to be displaying. In this case, for each of the elements inside of this list, one row is going to be created inside of the list view. And each of those rows is going to have as a data context one of the objects inside of the list. And this is going to happen automatically. All we have to worry about is setting the template for what each row is going to look like. And then inside of the template, get the path that we mentioned is necessary to join one property to another. What I mean by this is that one property of each one of the post objects inside of this list has to be bound to one property of one element that we are going to be defining. And so how do we define that template that is needed? Well, inside of the list view, the first thing that we want to define is the item template. Pretty easy, right? We're setting the item source. Now we have to set the item template for each of the rows that is going to be defined inside of this list view. So let's go ahead and do that. I am going to write list view, and then I am going to find item template. And then the item template, because it is going to be getting information for each of the elements inside of the list, requires a data template. Now, this data template is going to require a cell. And the type of cell that we're going to be using at the beginning is a text cell. Now, you may not see it appear as you write it down, but it does exist. Just make sure that you write text cell like this, and you will have a text cell for each of the cells or each of the rows that are going to be rendered inside of the list view. And then it is in here where we set the binding. What we want to do is set the binding to the text property of the text cell. And the binding is going to be established with curly braces, writing binding, and binding to one of the properties from the path. We no longer need to establish the path directly because it is automatically established by setting the item source. This means that the entire list view is going to have one context, and then the data template is going to have as a context one of the post objects that is inside of the list. So we no longer need to set the source, but we do need to set what property we're going to be using. And we really only have two options because the post object only has ID and experience. And we don't want to show the ID, we want to show the experience. So all we have to do is set the binding to be that property. And so now each of the cells is going to display as a text whatever value is inside of the experience property for the post that has been set as the data context for that particular cell. And because we're changing the item source every time we are reading from the database, remember that the onAppearing method is executed every time we navigate to the history page, then this list is always going to be up to date. So I am going to run on the simulator to test this, and if we did everything correctly, we are finally going to be able to see what we inserted into the database into the interface with the help of the list view. So here the application is running and I can log in. And the moment I log in, notice that immediately I am displaying the two elements that were already inside of the database. So we are now certain that this is working. We are displaying the posts that are inside of the database. And I can always go ahead and add more elements inside here. Save, be sure that the message is successful, head back to the list and see that indeed it is added to the list because we are re-rendering the list every time we set the item source. And we are setting the item source on the onAppearing method, which is called every time we get navigated back to the history page. So during this section, you have learned how to use SQLite databases inside of your Xamarin Forms application. You have learned the packages that it takes for this to work that you have to add through NuGet. We have learned that we need specific database paths from Android and from iOS and how to send those paths from both platforms, which reminds me that we should test this on iOS as well. But we also learned how to insert into databases, read from the databases. We learned a little bit about data binding and we learned the basics of the list view inside of Xamarin Forms. So now I do want to test this on the iOS simulator. So I am going to select iOS, make sure that we are connected to a Mac and so we can see the list of devices where we can run. Select one of them and click on Run. Once the application is running, then let's go ahead and test it. I am going to log in and right now I don't have anything because I haven't added anything previously. But I can easily go ahead and add some new elements into the database by navigating to this page, writing something, click Save. Notice that we are also getting this success alert, so anything that we did different on iOS, which is iOS specific code, is also working perfectly. Click OK, head back, and it is also being listed into the list view. So now, in the next section, we're going to learn about maps and location and how to implement them on both Android and iOS with the help of Xamarin Forms.